We're gonna get this thing going. Here we go.
Can you see me?
Hold on, let me see.
Oh,
Cannot see you. I can hear you. I can't see you.
okay, let's see if I can. Still can't. Oh, you know what it is? It is. Oh, how do I reverse it? Oh, there it is. Let's see. Hello.
There we
Let's see.
hey,
I'm on my phone.
hey. We getting there now.
Oh, goodness. Thank you so much for your patience. I'm not sure what was going on there. Like I had to do a lot of things just to make this work. Thank you so much.
Oh, no problem at all. I appreciate you joining us here. I appreciate it. So we're talking about the book Subversive Habits, right?
Yes.
Black Catholic nuns and the long African American freedom struggle. So if you can
Yes.
just kind of introduce yourself to everybody.
Hi, I am Dr. Shannen Williams. I am Associate Professor of History at the University of Dayton, and I am the author of Subversive Habits, Black Catholic Nuns and the Long African American Freedom Struggle, which provides the first full history of Black Catholic nuns in the United States and turns overdue attention to women's religious life in the Roman Catholic Church as a stronghold of white supremacy and racial segregation, and in turn, a significant battleground of the long African American freedom struggle.
All
I
right.
should also say that I am. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, I should also say that I am Catholic. I was born and raised in the Catholic Church. For those of you who have read the preface, I'm also the daughter of the first Black woman to graduate from the University of Notre Dame. So while I am a Black Catholic woman who studies Black Catholic women's history, up until 15 years ago, I did not know that Black nuns existed. I did not know that there were African American sisterhoods in the United States. I did not know any of this history outside of my family's own very small history within the, well, I shouldn't say it's a small history, but my own family's history within the church.
Yeah, and I had no idea, to be honest with you. My very limited understanding. I'm from Indiana, and I just happen to be a Notre Dame fan, and so that's how small my knowledge base was before I started reading this book.
Yeah.
Now, with this being the first full history of Black Catholic nuns, how did you go about doing a lot of your research for the book?
That's a great question. The field of U.S. Black Catholic history remains in its infancy. The challenge, of course, is, and perhaps what we all need to understand, is that Catholicism was the first Black articulation of Christianity in what becomes the United States. So often we forget that the Catholic Church introduced African slavery in the Americas, including the land area that became the United States. So often we focus on 1619, but that is not the first time in which we have enslaved Africans who are in what becomes the United States. The Catholic Church, Spanish Catholics, introduced African slavery into what becomes the United States almost a century before. So 1619 in itself really obscures the fact that so much of early African American history actually takes place under Catholic auspices and within Catholic boundaries. That Catholicism becomes the route in which so many early African Americans use to gain their freedom, but also to tear down slavery in whatever way that they can. I was very fortunate. This is the first full history of Black Catholic nuns in the United States. But in 1990, Father Cyprian Davis, who is the Dean of Black Catholic History in the United States, wrote the first full historical survey of U.S. Black Catholics in his landmark text, The History of Black Catholics in the United States. So in many ways, he helps to lay the foundation, but of course the sisters themselves do it. Black sisters who desegregated Catholic colleges and universities in their bachelor's, master's, and doctoral theses wrote the histories of their orders. And the nation's two oldest historically Black sisterhoods, which are also the oldest Roman Catholic sisterhoods for Black women in the modern Atlantic world, also maintain archives. So that was incredibly important for me. Sisters' obituaries matter, especially Black women who desegregate white communities. Now, if those women do not remain in those communities, oftentimes their records are closed. But the African American press and the Black Catholic press did a really great job. They documented Black sisters' efforts, their ministries. When a Black woman or girl desegregated a white order, the Black press was always on it, documenting it. And so there is a point when if a sister's archives or her records are closed because she didn't stay in religious life, you can go to the historical record, the newspaper record, to be able to find that. Also, I interviewed over 150, mostly sisters and ex-sisters, but also anyone whose lives intersected with Black sisters' history in any way. I used every resource imaginable: archival records, oral history records, periodical sources, and also visual sources. Sometimes photographs are the only sort of documentation that we have of a woman who was in religious life, especially if she did not remain. So whatever was there, I used it. And what's also critically important when we're talking about Black nuns and we're talking about Catholics, right? You know, even when census records did not document Black folks, right? The Catholic Church, if you were Catholic, you have baptismal records, you have confirmation records. There are ways in which Black people who were Catholic or who were enslaved by Catholics can trace their lineage in ways in which folks who were not enslaved by Catholics may not be able to do so. So if you intersect and your life intersects with the Catholic Church, there may be record. That doesn't mean that the Catholic Church does not engage in archival erasure, that we don't see all these other things taking place. But Black sisters in particular as well, these are highly educated women. They leave records behind. So I've been very fortunate to be able to access some of those records, in some cases getting special permission to access records that were closed and sealed off by the church. So that's a long way to say whatever was there, I tried to find it and reconstruct the history.
Now, you know, I'm always amazed by like historical research, you know, the amount of work that goes into it. How long did it take you to put this book together?
Too long. For researching and writing 14 years, I started this in 2007 during my second semester of my graduate program at Rutgers. And I really came upon this project by chance. As I mentioned, I am Catholic, but I did not know this history. I was really interested in religious women's contributions to the Black radical imagination of the post-World War II era. And so I had started in my graduate program just reading through microfilmed editions of Black-owned newspapers, looking for topics that had not been researched yet. And I stumbled upon this article announcing the formation of a Black Power Federation of Catholic Nuns called the National Black Sisters Conference, which had been organized in the wake of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And I experienced what I can only call like a metanoia. Here are these nuns all about Black power calling their church to task. And I didn't know this history, right? Like the only Black nun that I knew was Whoopi Goldberg's character in Sister Act, Sister Mary Clarence. So I started from there. I had this newspaper article and I had a list of sisters' names. I did a very 21st century thing and Googled the National Black Sisters Conference. The organization was still viable. They were still meeting. But I'd also seen that their papers had been deposited at Marquette University. And so I was in the middle of the semester when I couldn't get to Marquette. I was in Jersey, but I had a list of sisters' names and I knew the communities that they belonged to. So I literally started calling and writing mother houses to see if I could track some of these women down and to see if I could interview them. So I really started with oral histories, never intending to actually do as many oral histories that I did. But it became clear to me once you begin to encounter archival erasure, when you begin to realize that you can't access certain sisters' files, but also realizing that there are stories that will never be preserved in an archive, right? People are not going to tell you what they've done, like the harmful things that they've done, right? You may encounter it in the archive, but not really because they meant for that to be preserved. But really, when I began interviewing the sisters, I had to, one, learn a lot, but also begin to understand too, especially with the case of the African-American sisterhoods. These were formed because white orders would not accept Black women. But when I first started interviewing the members of the Black orders, I just assumed, I said, oh, well, you must have been educated by the Oblates or the Holy Family Sisters. And they were like, oh, no, I was educated by this white order of nuns. They rejected me, and I got lucky. Somebody directed me to the Black orders. Okay. But also remembering that there are a lot of vocations that were lost because white sisters refused to nurture Black vocations to religious life, both male and female, or just simply wouldn't send them to the Black orders, right? They may not have known, but we also just have to recognize the reality that many white priests and sisters were deeply committed to white supremacy, and some remain so.
Yeah, definitely. Now, a couple of things jumped out to me reading the book. Now, in the second chapter, I was shocked to hear that in 1916, the Catholic Church actually operated 112 schools for 13,000 Black youth nationwide. Um, how did you go about kind of learning that, and why is that so important?
It's so important because even though the numbers of Black Catholics have remained relatively small in the United States, right? Um, and Black Catholicism, right? Like if we talk about sort of the Americas, the vast majority of people who have lived their lives under the signposts of Catholicism have not been European. They have been people of African and European descent because the Catholic Church was the largest corporate slaveholder in the Americas.
Right.
Now, although the Catholic Church in the United States, does not invest in its Black Catholic educational infrastructure in the ways in which it does to its white, it's unequal. It does play a significant role in the education of African Americans. So even though there aren't large numbers of Black Catholics, they say that we're only about 4% of the national Catholic population, we are a significant portion of the Black Christian population in the United States. And many African Americans, whether they have been Catholic or not, have entrusted the church with the education of their children.
Right.
And part of that reason is because the Catholic Church did operate these schools oftentimes when the public educational system would not build enough schools proportionate to the Black population, or that they were grossly underfunded, and in certain places were non-existent, right? So if we think about it, as late as the 1920s, there was not one public high school for Black people in the state of Louisiana. That is obscene. It is absurd. But what we know is that Catholic schools were oftentimes among the earliest, in some cases, the earliest educational institutions open to African Americans. Part of what my book does is sort of remind us this is not done because of the goodwill of white Catholics, right? It is done because Black Catholics are putting pressure on their church to live up to its universal creed, right? You say that we are all equal in the eyes of God, well then how are we upholding a system that denies people or reduces people based on color and race? And so Black Catholics are taking their church at their word and saying, hey, we need to do this. And part of what I demonstrate, right, much of that early work is done by either the Black nuns or Black lay people who are able to convince white Catholics to invest in some way in this educational infrastructure that plays and continues to play a significant role in African American education, despite the profound failures of white Catholics who have been committed to white supremacy when they come into our schools and what they've done to our children. I mean, it's not something that I want to romanticize, right? Because we are now sort of grappling and continuing to grapple, right, with this story of colonization in Canada in terms of Native American residential schools. That happens in the United States too, but also that happens in Black Catholic schools, right? Sort of this mistreatment, this abuse. But when we talk about Black administered Catholic education, remember that it is Black nuns who are the first to embrace and celebrate the teaching of Black and Black Catholic history within Catholic boundaries, and who understand Catholic education as a route to Black liberation, which I wanted to center in the story of Black Catholic education in the Jim Crow South.
Yeah, definitely. And I had no idea about, like you said, about the really revolutionary push that a lot of the Black Catholic nuns did to force, even if it wasn't, like you said, an equal contribution, but to force a contribution at all in the Jim Crow South, like you said. And you talk about how since these schools presented a threat to Jim Crow and to white supremacy, that they were the target to many attacks. I never knew that either. Can you kind of expand on that a little bit?
Right. So we have to remember that in most instances, Black Catholic schools were interracial spaces, either meaning that the teachers and maybe the nuns and the priests were white and the youth were Black, and maybe there were some Black lay teachers, or when you had Black nuns running Black Catholic schools, generally, though, the priests would still be white because there was such an opposition to the ordination of Black men to the Catholic priesthood in the United States. Right. The earliest generations of African American men who were called to the priesthood, you have a few exceptions, but most of these men were either sent to Africa or they were sent to the Caribbean to minister in those spaces. That African American Catholic parishes were denied the opportunity to have priests of their own races to lead them. And that is just another one of these forms of of white supremacy and institutional racism, institutional anti-Blackness within the Roman Catholic Church within the United States. And so because they are interracial spaces, they automatically are going to become targets, right? Even though white priests and white sisters who minister in African American communities are subject to being called, N-word lovers or N-sisters or N-priest, and they are oftentimes ostracized by other white Catholics because they minister in the African American community. Their ministries in African American community does not signify a commitment to racial justice or racial equality. These same white priests and sisters will ostracize Black Catholics. They themselves uphold these ideas of white supremacy and sometimes even try to subject their charges to these denigrating sort of ideas and attitudes about themselves. But nonetheless, they are revolutionary spaces. We know Black parents fight back. And oftentimes because they're not under state regulation, right? Because they're private, it's a private institution. And so they become targets. We know that white supremacists, whether they are Catholic or otherwise, target Black Catholic schools. We have instances in which they burn them down. They are subject to arson, that the priests and sisters, as well as the youth who attend them, are targeted by other white people who are proponents of white supremacy, being teased, being subjected to verbal assaults, etc. We really have to understand how political, how revolutionary and radical Black Catholic education could be. That's not to say that it always was, but right. The very idea, right, of them crossing these color lines in ways outside of what is acceptable under white domination in Jim Crow becomes threatening. Again, that doesn't mean that most of these white Catholics who are ministering in the schools are revolutionaries, right? Many of them are not. It's true. And even the sisters recognize it themselves. The sisters have to be very careful navigating these spaces, not only within sort of secular community, but also within their church. And part of what I try to drive home, it's not that the Catholic Church is just absorbing sort of the racism of secular society, right? That they are very much involved in propagating this, that segregation and anti-Black racism are also Catholic traditions as a result of the church's mostly unreconciled histories of colonialism, slavery, and segregation. We have to remember that the Catholic Church is the largest Christian practitioner of segregation as well. So we have these instances in which Black folks, if they try to go into white parishes, will be subjected to verbal assaults, also physical assaults, are subjected to really humiliating segregation within these spaces. So it's a really complicated story, but it's one that is important that we also recognize just sort of the profound threat of Catholicism, because if actually people were upholding Catholic social teaching, they literally would have been very revolutionary spaces, right? And they are perceived to be that from people who are outside, who are ignoring that the church upholds segregation because they're looking at Catholic social teaching and they're sort of looking at the Vatican, right? And they're saying, well, the Vatican is saying that everybody's socially equal. Even if that doesn't play itself out in the United States, the very threat of the insurrectionary dimensions of Catholic social teaching that affirms the life and dignity of every person is threatening to the racial status quo of the United States. And it's why Black Catholics stay, right? They're just like, what these white Catholics are doing here, that's actually not upholding the law. So we can actually sort of look at Catholic social teaching. We can look to the Vatican. And it's why people stay, even when those of us looking at it now are like, well, why would people stay in a situation like that? Especially when they're being mistreated. What are they believing in that we can't necessarily see when we take it at face value?
Okay. Now, as like you said, as a person that identifies as a Catholic woman, right? How did you walk the kind of the line between, holding your religion responsible for some of the things that they've done, and also, not kind of pushing it too far? Like when you're doing your research, it's a very open and honest book. You take the religion to task for some of the things that they've done. How were you able to do that coming from, your Catholic background?
It's a great question. I don't know. And let me just say this as well. I have encountered a lot of resistance doing this work at every turn. I got really lucky in 2016. I was invited by a Black nun to give a talk at the annual meeting of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious, which is the largest organization of nuns in the United States. And they were doing work as an organization to confront their own complicity and agency in anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism. And, you know, when you are put on the stage in front of some of the most powerful women in the Catholic Church and you are running into all of these barriers, not getting access to archives, you ask them for help. I said, if you're serious about addressing anti-Black racism, I need access to these records. I need access to congregational minutes where you took votes on whether or not to accept Black women. I need access to closed files of Black sisters who did not remain in your communities. And several communities stepped forward and they said, well, we are sincere. What do you need from us? And so I was very fortunate that many communities started inviting me into their communities to do presentations. And so even when we could not find a sister's file because we did not know her secular name or anything like that, there was generally an older sister in that community who remembered her, who could remember what her name was so that we could find the file, or at least would allow me to interview her so that we can reconstruct that story. But let me just say this, I ran into a lot of problems. When I was a very young graduate student, I did not realize what I would find. And I used to tell people, you know, had I known what I would find, I probably wouldn't have started this project. I had to be I didn't know, you know, I was a young graduate student. And I'll tell another story, but I was at a conference, well, it's kind of a conference. And I remember sort of doing this presentation on these anti-Black admission policies. And then afterwards, this nun, distinguished theologian, I'm a young graduate student. I don't think I was even a PhD candidate yet. Afterwards, you know, she raised her hand, red-faced, and, you know, she said, well, fine, yes, we excluded, you know, Black women. But there were anthropological reasons for why we did that. And it sucked the air out of the room. Like, I'm in a room full of over 100 people there, scholars, and here she is, right, in all of her anger. And let me just say it, in evil. This is evil. What happened to some of these women who went into communities, who went in as young as 14 and 15 in hostile communities. And I realized at that moment I had not let everything in. I had been sort of collecting these stories and I was trying to maintain some kind of emotional distance. And I remember calling an ex-nun who had founded the National Black Sisters Conference, and I couldn't even tell her what had happened immediately. And you said, you just need to breathe, and then you need to say what she did. And I said it, and she said, there it is, right? So this is the stuff that's never going to be written down, that happened to us behind closed doors, the ways in which we were terrorized in these convents. And that's when I realized, you know, I was going to have to take a risk in telling these stories, because I'm telling the stories about people who are literally, in some cases, have been literally declared saints by the Catholic Church. So how do you call us? You know, it's like, why do we have books written about women who were slaveholders and we talk about these women as models of charity? Like, that's obscene, right? But you don't get to, and while that may be obscene in every other circle that you operate in, it is not obscene to say that. It's obscene to sort of say such things in every other circle that you're a part of, but not in sort of Catholic intellectual circles. Right. That the idea that it's, you know, it's okay that people were slaveholders because the church, you know, Catholic slaveholding was benign, which is not true. But these are the myths that have been institutionalized as truth within the field. And so what happens when you know a story and that people have been carrying stories that upend every one of these myths, right? And it's not that their stories are not true, but that there has been a systematic erasure of Black Catholics from the story of the American Catholic experience, but there's also been a gross misrepresentation of it. It's not simply, you know, you can erase them, but even when they're mentioned in ways that are so wrong, so offensive that they gaslight people in ways that, you know, I couldn't even, you know, for a long time, I just literally kept my mouth shut and did my work. That's the only way that I could do it. But I say that all to say, the reason why I wrote this book was because I was asked to write the book by a woman who had been erased, who was formerly Sister M. Martin de Porres Gray, who was the chief architect of the National Black Sisters Conference, who's now Dr. Patricia Gray. When I first met her, you know, this is someone who's been erased from the history because her story sort of upends a lot of myths in the story, in the history of the American Catholic experience. You know, she told me that the National Black Sisters Conference in the 60s and 70s, what they wanted to do, and they recognized we needed to write our own history, and they weren't able to do that. And so when she agreed to speak with me, and this is a woman who had been silent for nearly 50 years, would actually turn down Eyes on the Prize because they had contacted her to interview her for that series years ago, decades ago. She said, you know, I'll only talk to you if you agree not to write a book about me or simply a book about the National Black Sisters Conference and Black nuns and Black power. But she said, try to tell all of our stories. And even though she didn't know all of the history, she knew that you could not, and I understood that, you couldn't understand that formation of the National Black Sisters Conference without understanding these earlier struggles. And that it's a far more complicated story than we knew. And so my book was really an attempt to sort of recognize that there had been so many forces that had coalesced to say that Black sisters' history did not matter. But I had to be the person building on some really important research before me, saying that their history does matter, and it has always mattered, right? And that Black sisters, right, are not these anomalies, and Black Catholics are not these anomalies, right? That we're there in significant ways, especially if we're talking about the South, and eventually into the North and Midwest and West as well. But then also because telling our stories forces us to sort of, you know, confront this erasure, this systematic erasure and misrepresentation that is in its service, in the service of white supremacy. What I always say is that, you know, one of the greatest weapons of white supremacy, perhaps the most dangerous weapon of white supremacy, is its ability to erase the history of its violence and its victims. Yep, and so when we're talking about Black sisters who've been here almost 200 years, and that it's taken till 2022 for us to get the first full history of their history, right? Like that in itself is the testament to the erasure, to the testament to the commitments of white supremacy and really the power of historical truth-telling.
Yeah, definitely. And I know you spoke a couple times about the National Black Sisters Conference. And in the 5th chapter, you speak about the very first conference in 1968. And you talk about how it was attended by some of the most educated people in the country, and many who had broken racial barriers prior to Brown versus Board of Education. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Right. So the members of the historically Black sisterhoods during the Jim Crow period, beginning in the 1920s, very quietly began desegregating Catholic colleges and universities in order to get their schools accredited. So right after World War I, the laws began to change, requiring the higher education of private school teachers. And so for Black sisters, the members of the Black orders, and all the Black orders were teaching orders, except one, which was a contemplative order, but the biggest orders were teaching orders. Their schools were in jeopardy of closing because they needed to get a higher education, but church law and Vatican mandates said that all Catholics must be educated in Catholic schools. But Catholic colleges and universities would not take Black folks, even sisters. And so they have to sort of forge agreements with willing white provincials and white orders to be able to desegregate those institutions. So St. Louis University, Catholic University of America, several sort of significant Catholic colleges and universities are desegregated long before the Brown decision by members of the Black teaching orders. In some instances, those women who are able to enter those communities, they forge agreements that require the university to open up their ranks to all Black people. In other instances, they can only sort of desegregate the institutions as religious, but secular Black students are still barred. It just depends on the situation. But then also Black women who desegregate white orders, really beginning after World War II. These women are also desegregation foot soldiers. Many of them have to desegregate the orders, they desegregate the convents, and convents are just where nuns live, and so there are multiple convents for a community across the country. They oftentimes have to desegregate their orders, colleges and universities, but also the schools in which they teach or the hospitals in which they administer. So Black sisters are oftentimes some of the first Black nurses in Catholic hospitals, the first Black teachers in white Catholic institutions. They are the first people to head Catholic hospitals. Okay. Many of them who go on to earn their doctorates then desegregate the faculties of their colleges. So we're talking about women who are breaking all kinds of barriers, perhaps most notably Dr. Francis Douglas, who is the first African American to earn a PhD in psychology from Fordham University, is believed to be the first African American to chair a department at a historically white university in the United States. We always thought it was the great Dr. John Hope Franklin, the great African American historian, who in 1956 in September becomes the head of the history department at Brooklyn College. But that same month, the same year, Dr. Francis Douglas is chairing the psychology department at DePaul in Chicago. So a lot of stories like that that I don't even begin to touch on. I touch on pieces of it in the book, but there's so much more that's there that hopefully I'll be able to do at a later time.
Okay. Now, I know on the introduction, you speak about rethinking the U.S. Catholic experience and the Black church. Surveying the lives and struggles of African-American nuns reveals that Black Catholics have never been the footnotes in the history of the U.S. church or the wider nation. And, talk about how this book calls on scholars to expand their understanding of the U.S. Catholic experience and turn more attention to the great diversity of the Black religious experience. What all feedback have you received from some of those scholars to the research and the work that you've put into this book?
Right now, the feedback has been good, positive. I haven't seen any academic reviews of the book yet, but when I started the project, I knew that I was also building upon, this very sort of committed group of scholars who have been really calling upon us to sort of, one, define what we mean by the Black church, but then also be very clear about recognizing the diversity of the Black religious experience. And again, as I say, Catholicism was the first Black articulation of Christianity in the Americas, right? The first Christian marriage that we have taking place in the land area that becomes the United States is between a free Black Catholic woman from Spain and a Spanish soldier in St. Augustine, Florida, right? St. Augustine, and that's 1565. St. Augustine, right, is our nation's oldest city, colonized by the Spanish, right? So they are free Black Catholics who are with those early colonizing conquistadors, but they're also bringing enslaved Black Catholics, some who are living in Europe, but then some who are also coming as a result of the transatlantic slave trade, again, which the Catholic Church plays a foundational and leading role. And so part of what I think a lot of people, and I'm very much building upon sort of the great work of people who have reminded us that remember that the U.S. Catholic Church begins as a Southern church. The church is the first and the largest corporate slaveholder in also what becomes the United States, if we're talking about Florida, Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, and Louisiana. And so while Black Catholics nationally may not have had a significant profile in these spaces like Florida, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Louisiana, Black Catholics made up a significant portion of the population. In some cases, a small majority. And in a case like in New Orleans, right, it was a Black female dominated Catholic church by the time of the early 19th century. So reminding us of sort of thinking about who these people are, who Black Catholics are, and also pushing back and saying sort of this very enduring myth that somehow Black Catholics are politically conservative, that they've been politically complacent with white supremacy. And the challenge, of course, has been, or what I've gotten back, so much of the feedback has been, I just didn't know that. I didn't know Homer Plessy was Catholic. I didn't know all these Black Catholic freedom fighters, all these Black freedom fighters were Catholic. And I was like, and that's the problem. If we're thinking about someone like Thaddeus Stevens, the white radical Republican, right, who sort of pushes and makes sure we get the 14th Amendment, right? What about his partner, his longtime partner, this Black laywoman who is running this underground railroad system with him, right, who we believe was his common law wife? She is Catholic. They are Catholic. What does that mean? And part of what has been really great for me in terms of the initial feedback are people who are confirming the stories. There's one case in chapter 3 when I focus on the desegregation of the white sisterhoods and the violence that these women often encounter. I tell the story of one Black nun in Chicago in 1962 was sent to desegregate a Catholic grammar school in Chicago, and the white mothers revolted and picketed and got her out of there. And I had been told by one Black sister, she said, I think that happened to an Afro-Puerto Rican sister in my community. And I say that in the footnotes, I say it could be the same case. Well, after the book came out, I received an email from a white priest in Minnesota, and he said, hey, I just saw your book. I don't know if you ever met these women, but there were two Black lay women who were in my parish who were former nuns. They have since passed on, but he sent me their obituaries. And the obituary of one, she was a Servite of Mary, and that is what happened to her. That was the one who was pushed out in 1962, where they revolted against her, and she left the community after she was attacked by those white Catholic mothers. And so, for me, what has been really fascinating is to sort of get the feedback of people who are telling me even more amazing stories. Most recently, I heard from a woman who, she's like, you just told my story. My grandmother took my mom and all of her daughters, who were all octoroons in Louisiana. We were cradle Catholics. We migrated to Chicago because she needed to protect her daughters from rape from white men. And so she went to Chicago. And then she said we were living in this multiracial community. And then my grandmother tried to enroll her daughters into the Catholic school, and the white priest said no. And she said my grandmother became an atheist after that. That was the day my grandmother became an atheist, and we have been done with this church. So what I recognize, or at least sort of the greatest feedback that I've been getting, is people are right. You hit it on the head, you told it. And everyone else who was saying is that we all know you know more than you're saying. And I am.
Yeah.
Because there are some interviews I can't use. I know one sister, she desegregated her public school, and she said, I want you to tell the story, but if you tell my story, you have to tell the story. Like if you name me, you name my sibling. And she has, in the year of our Lord, 2022, has a sibling passing for white, who is married with kids, passing for white, or just really other stories that I couldn't even, sisters who were like, don't say it because who are elderly. They're in their communities. They're the only Black member of their community. So they fear reprisals.
Yeah.
Those are stories that I also did not tell. I am not going to put anyone in danger for telling their truth. And that's just sort of a sad testament to where we are, that telling the truth can result in reprisals. So
can result in so many kind of unforeseen circumstances, right? Violence, or kind of just changing people's lives. Like you said, she's married, she's passing for white, and just telling her story could just really drastically change her life in an instant. Now, in the fourth chapter, I was surprised. I consider myself to be kind of a history buff a little bit. I thought I was, but in the fourth chapter, I was shocked to hear about the connection of Black nuns with the Selma protest. Can you tell us some more about that?
Right. So Selma is an important moment for the Catholic Church. Before that, the Catholic Church at best had been ambivalent towards the civil rights movement. We know that Black lay Catholics in particular had been very much a part of secular civil rights organizations, had been a part of civil rights organizations within the church. But the vast majority of Catholics who were actively involved in the civil rights movement prior to the liberalizing reforms of the Second Vatican Council that will lead up to sort of the church's, we will say, formal embrace of the civil rights movement in 1965 with the Selma voting rights marches. Prior to that, it's really Black lay Catholics. We do know some Black sisters are members of civil rights organizations. They are teaching Black history. They're involved in interracial council organizations within the church. But Selma is the turning point. We get large numbers, hundreds of Catholic priests and sisters who travel to Selma, and then thousands more who participate in Selma sympathy marches throughout the country. In Selma, in that first delegation of Catholic nuns to go to Selma is one Black nun who had desegregated her community, Sister Mary Antonia Ebo, who was featured on the cover of the book. That photo of her is taken in Selma in 1965 while she is speaking to reporters. And so there are two Black nuns who travel to Selma, and then there are several more who participate in Selma sympathy marches, both who are members of Black and the white sisterhoods. What was really interesting in my oral history interviews, several Black sisters who were members of white orders also said, I wanted to go to Selma, I was asked to go, and then my superiors wouldn't let me go. So the people who controlled their community were the heads of their communities. They didn't want me to become militant. They didn't want me involved. Because Selma is significant because you see large numbers of Catholic sisters, and there was so much media attention on nuns marching. Sort of the habit sort of gave a certain kind of legitimacy in the minds of white folks who had sort of still looked at the civil rights movement with suspicion. Now you have representatives of, one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful Catholic Church in the nation, one of the most powerful Christian churches in the nation, which is the Catholic Church, and then the global Catholic Church, who are there and who are present. So what's significant about that chapter, at least what I wanted to do with that chapter, is push back against this idea that because there were not large numbers of Black sisters who were marching, signified political complacency. So part of what I wanted to one is sort of point out, one, Black sisters did march. A lot of them did. The photos are there. Whether or not they've been included in many of these collections of sisters marching is one thing. So they are marching, but I also wanted to outline many of the barriers that Black sisters were encountering when they tried to go, when they wanted to participate in demonstrations. Even the Black superiors, the heads of the Black orders, were very hesitant about letting their members participate in demonstrations. And that is very much rooted in the fact that Black sisters and their superiors understood that those sisters would be treated differently. And they will tell you in their oral history interviews, like, I was fearful because I felt like if we were arrested, I knew that I would be segregated, right? I would be separated from the white sisters, that my habit would not protect me. In the Deep South, the Black members, the Black orders are also deeply concerned because they feel like that they're the greatest testament to their commitment to racial justice is in their schools. And they say, well, we need sisters in school, in the classroom, not marching, like we do our work in the classrooms. And so there are a lot of barriers that Black sisters who are seeking to become active in the civil rights movement face. But that does not mean that they are not fighting their own battles. That means they are in some instances protesting Catholic history textbooks that exclude African Americans. They are fighting racism within their communities. And what I wanted to do with this in this chapter is really expand our understanding of the political. What does it mean if the Sisters of the Holy Family in New Orleans don't participate in any of these public demonstrations, but they win, they're able to sort of enroll their members as the earliest Black students at Loyola in New Orleans? What does it mean that they, after decades of mistreatment, those who worked on as domestics for the bishops and the priests and the seminarians, revolt against those men, and they are able to sort of win some concessions? That those are also political victories that we have to think about. That political means very different things for us, and certainly for Black women who are navigating the racism and the sexist contours of society in their church, that they battle differently, right? They do march, right? They do a lot of the things that we traditionally associate with political activism, but sometimes, telling this priest off, and in one case, right, this sister who beats this priest, right? It's like to the point where they say that she severely attacked him, right? And we don't know exactly what happened, but she says, remember, we are ladies. And to understand the kinds of violence that they are encountering in these spaces, for a sister to fight back, that means she has been pushed to a wall.
Yeah.
That means something terrible is happening in that seminary. To the point where she is not only going to fight back and hit a priest, but also that her superiors are backing her, and also that they give in and they offer the sisters some concessions, means that they are also still fighting battles. And sometimes they have to be very strategic because, as I also say in the book, right, an assaulted or murdered African American nun would have garnered very little sympathy in a place like New Orleans, where white Catholic segregationists proved themselves willing to bomb white churches and white convents that were supporting desegregation. And so we truly have to understand how dangerous those times were for everyone involved, right? Certainly for any African American activist. People are literally putting their lives on the line, but not simply in demonstrations, but also in their day-to-day realities and their day-to-day interactions with the people in their environment.
Definitely. And when you think about, like you said, revolting on a day-to-day basis, right? It's a more of a direct revolt, and also in some ways it's a little more dangerous because, like you said, a murdered Black nun will not raise an eyebrow, especially if they don't know the story. So if somebody attacks a priest in their own hometown, there's no cameras around, there's no nothing, they can be taken out the back, and then nobody ever says anything else about it.
Absolutely. Like we truly have to understand, and I say this not just simply for nuns and Black Catholics, right? But just Black folks in general living under Jim Crow. When we look at our ancestors and what they were able to accomplish and what they were able to build, the infrastructures that they gave us, they did so with so much less, but also in a time in which we could literally come up missing. And no one would care. No one would know, right? That the habit did not protect these women from violence, right? And in fact, it could invite it because they embody something, right? When we think about what it means for these Black women to embrace the religious state, the celibate religious state, when the very foundations of white supremacy are built on the idea that Black people are inherently stupid, immoral, all of those things. These women embody that. It's why the very sight of a nun would cause reactions, right? Literally, we have examples of white folks when they see nuns verbally assaulting them. Who are you, right? Because on this idea of white supremacy, right, that is grounded in this Christianity, we are the moral. We are, whiteness is superior. It is superior morally, intellectually, spiritually, everything. And then you have these Black nuns come along. It's also why the members of the Black sisterhoods and select Black members of white sisterhoods to this day still wear the veil. Most white nuns have abandoned the veil, and the Black sisters will tell you, we fought so hard to have them. They tried so hard to deny us the veil. We'll never give up the veil. But it's also an assault, right, on white supremacy, on these foundations of white Christian supremacy. And that's also what I point out in the book, right? We can't even understand this systematic erasure, right? That's how powerful Black sisters and their history is. It's also why I included so many images of Black sisters, because so many people have never seen them. And so the power of seeing these women, and everyone knew it, including perhaps the greatest intellectual of us all, in Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, right? When he goes to Paris at the World's Fair and he includes this image of the Holy Family Sisters, that here is the subversive power of Black female virtue in the face of this savage white sort of violence that Black people have faced for decades, but certainly in the wake of white redemption following Black Reconstruction, right? After this moment of this great promise, after the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, right? Like the nation will be met with this savage white backlash. What we saw and what was called and what whites themselves called white redemption, right? And so it is powerful for us to sort of think about who these women were, what they did, what they stood for, to understand sort of the power of Black celibacy within the Roman Catholic tradition, because it was, again, the Catholic Church. We have to understand this. It was the Catholic Church that, with the passage of a series of papal bulls that become known as the Christian doctrine of discovery, which sort of authorized European colonialism and in the Americas and Africa and other places, but also sanctioned the development of the transatlantic slave trade, that those papal bulls literally said that Black and brown lives didn't matter. And yet something miraculous happened in the 19th century slave South. Free Black women and girls won the right to organize sisterhoods to minister to Black people under the guise of Catholicism, and not even under the guise of Catholicism, through Catholicism as faithful members of the church. These women dared the church to live up to its creed. They said in their actions and in their words that the lives, the souls, and the futures of Black people mattered. They told us this. They've done it. It helps us to explain so much of the erasure, but also the great opposition that they have faced throughout their time in the Catholic Church. The church that is most responsible for the rise of African slavery in the Americas. And so until we truly understand this Catholic story, that it is a foundationally Catholic story, I don't think that we'll even begin to understand how much is owed to Black people in terms of reparations and everything else, to understand what the Catholic Church did and how much profit was made off of these systems of exploitation and power.
And just the amount of power from the book is evident in somebody, in the Catholic women knowing and understanding the Catholic Church's place in establishing these slave trades, right? And then fighting back against them while staying within the Catholic religion, right? Saying, hey, I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to hold you responsible for the things you've done. You know what I mean? That's a very, very powerful stance to take.
It is. Like, I think about it in terms of the Sisters of the Holy Family in New Orleans. After the Civil War, one of the first things that community does is start buying up properties that were associated with the sins of slavery and the sexual abuse of Black women and girls. One of the first properties that their new superior buys was a former slave trader's pen. And in their first history, they said it must have been the will of God that the sisters would buy the property and expiate the sins of slavery there, right? And turn it into a school. They buy the former quadroon ballroom where women of their color and class would have been subjected to these sort of relationships and connected to these men who would have sort of subjected to them to what we consider to be sexual exploitation, this system of concubinage that was known as plissage, where these European men would take free women of color as basically their common law wives. And so these women are sort of rejecting this. Many of them are the products of this system of plissage, and they understand it as sexual slavery. I think what's also just really critically important, and at least for me, and when people ask me why I stay in the church, I say it's very hard. It's hard. It's hard. I don't know. Like, you know, every now and then I'm like, I don't know. I might be gone. The kid may be gone. But I do say I stay, certainly when I look at this history, right? Because when I came to the project, I was thinking about leaving the church, and not because of anything in particular per se, but I simply didn't know that I had a place in the church. I didn't know this history. I didn't know this history of resistance. I also didn't know this history of faithfulness. And see, this is the point that I continue to sort of drive home when I want to, right? It's like, you all are like, oh my goodness, you know, the Black Catholics, they've suffered so much. I was like, do you understand that these people knew that they were better than all these people around them?
Right.
Like, do you not understand that them staying and suffering in the midst of this? Like, when we look back at this now and we say, well, you know, the Oblate Sisters of Providence, which are the first successful Black order in the United States, you know, they were like, they don't own slaves. That most of their white counterparts and even their Afro-Creole counterparts own enslaved people. The Oblates in Baltimore don't do that. It's a choice that they make. And so when we look at it now, you know, we're saying, oh, when people say, well, you know, Catholics who owned enslaved people, they were just people of those times. And it's like, the Oblate Sisters of Providence are also people of those times.
Right.
They knew better. They made the choice, and that makes them better than everybody else, right? Like, and they are still here with us. And so for all these other communities that did this, well, they needed to do this because they needed to establish the financial foundations of their communities. The Oblates are still here too. So is St. Francis Academy, right? Like, those are making choices, and there was an understanding of these women that you don't negotiate on those issues. Not only did they not enslave people or accept enslaved people as a part of their members' salaries, they admit informally enslaved women into their ranks prior to the Civil War. They, in fact, accept one woman who is still enslaved prior to she's able to sort of gain her freedom. So that demonstrates an understanding that not only is slavery immoral and wrong, but that one did not have to engage and depend on slavery to build in the name of God. Like, that in itself, it's what I sort of drive home, or I hope that I drive home. You know, the Oblates and many of these Black sisters are the absolute best of us. You know, that's the other piece, you know, when we look back at some of these, you know, these white orders that practiced segregation, that held people in slavery, were just as violent as everyone else, right? You know what it's hard not to say this, right? Like, my goodness, if this is the best of people, what do the worst do? What do the worst do? These are the best of people. Like, what do the worst do? But it's also a reminder, they are actually not the best of us. Look to the Black sisterhoods. Look to Black Catholics who were willing to lay bare and suffer profound humiliation to expose the lie and evil of white supremacy. That is the gift that they've also given us, that we did not have to. It's not that people are just suffering for the sake of suffering, right? They are proving the point that we are talking about people who truly believe in this, who can testify to it, who are the closest to God, right, if we will. It's these Black Catholics who suffered greatly, but even in the face of that suffering, did not denigrate themselves, who fought to make their church truly Catholic, who pushed back whenever they could. And I say this in terms of, you know, I'm here because of those people. You know, my mother converted to Catholicism as a young girl, as a 7-year-old, when she was educated by white nuns at a Black Catholic school. But, you know, my mother doesn't speak well of, I shouldn't say, she does not cite the nuns as reasons for the conversion. She cites the Black lay people in her community. She said, though, I followed my friends in the church. I went with them. And that's what so many Black Catholics will tell you. Now, if you read so much of the history of the Catholic Church, what you'll see is, you have these hagiographic accounts of noble white priests and sisters who are bringing Black people into the church. And yet when you do the oral history, they're like, I followed a priest in the church. My friend was Catholic. Like my folks had migrated to Chicago. They were in the Bay Area. And there were these people in our communities who were cradle Catholics. And we started going to church with them. That's why we became Catholic. Or there was this Black lay woman or man who was ministering in our community. They were the best of us. You ask Black Catholics who modeled this life of charity and service to them, they do not, by and large, cite white priests or sisters. They say, it was my grandfather. It was my grandmother. It was my mother. It was my father. And so once you begin to hear those stories, you uncover a tradition, another tradition, right? Not only of us, another chapter of the Black freedom struggle, but of faithfulness that is there. These people are in, and that's the thing too, the people are in the records. But if you are going into these archives with an understanding, a false understanding that white Catholics are somehow the saviors of Black people, you will see Black people who are mentioned in every source and not cite them. Because you're looking for the white savior and not looking for the people who literally are doing the work right in front of you. And so, someone asked me, they said, well, how did you find all this stuff? And I said, well, yeah, I went looking, but let me be very clear. It's not hidden. It's right there. Like literally parishes. They were like, oh, well, the parish was founded maybe in 1944, but they were meeting for 2 decades before. Begging for a priest to come and minister to them, but they were meeting at the home of a Black lay person. Right. Oh, really? Really? But because lay people cannot found churches, the priest will be cited as founding the church, even if the church had been operating for 20 years before. So that is what we also have to sort of grapple with. But for me, what's been really interesting is to really sort of see very clearly the moral, the spiritual, and educational leadership of Black Catholics in their own communities, in their own histories. It's not that they weren't there. They have always been there. They are still there. We just literally needed a group of scholars to say, hey, well, how about we cite this person who everybody else cites instead of this other person who, just the church cites.
And that speaks to the sense of community and strength, and also speaks to the, like we talked about, the white savior and erasure of our history, where we can be meeting for, like you said, 2 decades at a Black woman's house or a Black woman's property. And we're meeting and we're doing all of the things that we need to do to be recognized. But then it takes this usually white person to come in and they say, okay, I found this space. And then they are credited with that. And then all the history is somewhat erased until it takes somebody to discover it and bring it to the light.
And that's what I say, people ask me, my emotions about all of this. And, at some point, maybe I'll tell more about some of the resistance. I say, if there's anything that will keep me up at night, that will keep me angry, is how many Black Catholics, men and women, were allowed to die without having their stories collected. And so for anybody, whether you're Catholic or otherwise, go put cameras in front of your elders, let them tell you their stories, because we're losing them. And we're going to lose so much of this history that we cannot afford to lose. So many of these women, in the case of Frances Douglass, who was, the first Black person to chair a department at a historically white institution, her colleagues didn't even know she was a nun because she didn't wear a habit, because her community didn't wear habits. People didn't even know who she was, right? And let alone knew that that her story needed to be collected. It's baffling how close we came to losing so much of this history, but also really tragic how much we have lost because we have not looked to our elders in the way, obviously some of us have, but we haven't been looking in the ways in which we have, at least in terms of collecting the stories of resistance, of survival, and also the faithfulness, right? Like, how did they stay? Because, that's why I always sort of say to myself, and why I told myself, well, I can't really leave because these women went through much more than what I've been through. And Lord, if they can stay, I know I can stay. But yeah, I think that's where I'm at right now. let's see how much we can preserve while we still have the chance.
Now, what are if you had to list maybe three main takeaways? Well, not even three. We won't minimize that. But what do you want the reader to take away from this book?
Ooh, it's a great question. First, that the history of Black Catholic women, religious and lay, is absolutely essential to our understanding of the making of U.S. Catholicism and the role of the Catholic Church in the Black freedom struggle. There can be no conversation of the church's engagement with the Black freedom struggle without centering Black Catholic nuns, because long before there were Black priests, there were Black nuns in the United States. And in fact, it's their spiritual successes that help ensure that Black men are going to have an open door into the Catholic Church and into the priesthood. Also, Black sisters are among the nation's most important Black freedom fighters and desegregation pioneers. We truly have to understand that particular desegregation battle that takes place outside of the protection of news cameras. So many of these women, what they did was not documented in any sort of national news outlet. Many of the Black women who desegregate white sisterhoods generally had to travel hundreds and even thousands of miles away from their hometowns to be able to enter those communities. But then when they began to desegregate their orders, the convents, the schools, the hospitals, etc., they had to do so away from the protection of news cameras, but also away from the protection of the Black communities that had nurtured their vocations. So when we think about the desegregation pioneers, our noble, wonderful folks who desegregated public schools and high schools and all these other public institutions during the era of Brown, remember, they get to go home at night. They get to go back to the protection of their communities, to the loves of their families, to recuperate, to be sort of built back up so they can go back into that school or in that other space day in and day out. Black sisters, Black women and girls who desegregated white communities could not do that. And third, I think what I've said initially, if we are truly committed to the fight for racial justice and reparations, then we have to turn our attention to the Catholic Church, which was the first global institution to say that Black and brown lives did not matter. That if we ignore the Catholic story, even though the population in the United States may be small, when we look at the global population of Christians, Black Christians, most of us are Catholic. Even in the Americas, the vast majority of us are Catholics. And so if we don't understand that story, to understand the ways in which the Catholic Church, which is the nation's oldest, largest, and arguably most influential Christian denomination, if you do not understand the role of the Catholic Church in the social, political, and cultural propagation of white supremacy and anti-Blackness, and quite frankly, misogynoir, if we can't understand that, we're never going to get anywhere. Especially when we begin to sort of think about our contemporary moment, and everybody has been paying attention to the role of the Catholic Church in the contemporary moment and saying, well, how is the Catholic Church involved in that? And I was like, well, that's not a surprise if you know this foundational history whatsoever. That you have to understand that it was the nation's first Catholic Supreme Court justice, and Roger Taney, who said that Black people had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. Mm-hmm. That is the Catholic tradition. That is the Catholic foundation in this country. That there was indeed a Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence as well. And in fact, who fathered at least one child with an enslaved woman in his household, whose daughter became one of the earliest Oblate Sisters of Providence, and who founded the first Black Catholic school in Washington, D.C. The connections are there. We just need to see them. But I do also believe that the blueprint for our liberation is also through this tradition. That doesn't mean you need to be Catholic, but you just need to understand the role of the Catholic Church in this history.
And here on chapter 6 again, you highlight the struggle for community-controlled Black Catholic education. What all is the struggle for that community-controlled Black Catholic education, and why is it so important?
So the struggle for community control came out of the Black Power movement and the Black liberation movement of the late 60s and 70s for people who were um, deeply concerned and who deeply believed that the way to ensure educational excellence and equity would be through completely controlled community institutions, community controlled institutions. And that wasn't just simply the schools, it was through police, it was through all these public infrastructures that had been a problem. And so there was this idea that if you have Black control, then these institutions that have been made to be useful for other groups of people will finally be able to become sites of liberation for Black people. Black sisters get involved in this in part because they are also facing the crisis of their church beginning to close many high achieving Catholic schools that were either located in Black communities or inner city communities that were becoming predominantly Black as a result of the African American migration, but also white flight out of the inner cities and into suburban communities. And so many Black Catholics actually believe that the church beginning to close these institutions was part and parcel of its participation in massive resistance to the civil rights movement and the Black freedom struggle. So Black sisters become involved because of their own connections with the Black freedom struggle, and Black sisters who were stationed in Boston in particular become involved with some of the leaders of community controlled who were professors at Harvard University, perhaps most notably Dr. Kenneth Haskins. It was Dr. Kenneth Haskins who, in his role in the graduate program in education, sort of offered support to Black nuns and specifically the National Black Sisters Conference in their fight to save as many Black Catholic schools as possible by turning them into community-controlled institutions. They were able to do so for several schools in Boston, most notably the St. Joseph Community School, that was run for quite some time by Sister Sylvia Thibodeau, who was a sister of the Holy Family and a leader of the National Black Sisters Conference. I point to that school also because several of Dr. Haskins' graduate students taught at St. Joseph. They built the curricula. They worked with the sisters very closely. And among those graduate students, one was was a woman named Patricia Hill, who became Dr. Patricia Hill Collins, who is sort of the great Black feminist theorist, sociologist. And in her book, Black Feminist Thought, when I read it as an undergraduate without even knowing this history, she talks about sort of her work at this community controlled school. And, years later, I find out that is her. So part of the other sort of piece of Black sisters' political history, right, is not only building a Black administered Catholic educational infrastructure, but also fighting to preserve it when they are under assault as a part of sort of the backlash to the civil rights movement. What was really fascinating to me when you go through the papers of the National Black Sisters Conference, they are not only sort of building Black studies curricula that they're sending Black sisters back into their schools to sort of teach with, but they're also hosting these decolonization institutes, right? That we have to decolonize our students' minds. We have to re-educate ourselves because we've been miseducated. And so when we think about sort of this contemporary sort of conversation and language around decolonization, it's important to remember, right, that it has a precedent, right? So all this work that so many entities were doing within the realm of Black power, for me, it was important to sort of remind us that Black nuns were also doing this work because the vast majority of them were educators who were fighting for Black studies, many of whom will go on to become sort of pioneering professors, womanist theologians, et cetera, and who are engaging with some of the Black leaders of the time, right, the great intellectual minds. Even in the book, I don't talk about the fifth meeting that was at Spalding College in Louisiana, and Amari Baraka is there, and they're sort of engaging with him. Again, what I say is that I really haven't even scratched the surface of what is there in terms of all this important work that these women were doing. And then in one particular, in the case of, I'm blanking on the name of the police force that was established in Detroit that had killed so many kids, but like the first assault on this sort of police force in Detroit when they killed 2 teenagers, the first community meeting was actually called by a Black nun who was a founding member of the National Black Sisters Conference because the young men had just been at the community center where she was working, and so she was walking out and she witnessed the murder. She witnessed it. And so she was like, we got to get, we have to get them stress. It was stress. And, when I interviewed her, and by that time, when I interviewed her, she was in Nigeria because her community was establishing a community in Nigeria. And she said, and I was like, do you remember that? Because she's featured in the papers of the Black Panther because she's featured, calling at the first community meeting, and she's featured. They have a photo of her speaking. And I asked her, Sister Elizabeth Harris, I said, Sister Elizabeth, do you remember the case? And she said, absolutely. And I said, do you remember the name of the police officer who killed the boy? She said, absolutely. And she spelled his name out. Like she said, you know, it took us a long time, but we got him off of the force. I don't know what happened to him afterwards, but she could spell his name. Like she just laid it out for me. And so it was just a reminder in terms when we talk about community control and when we talk about Black power, not only are Black sisters involved, they are involved in ways in which we can't even imagine. There's one other story that I'll briefly tell, well, maybe two. Two of the Panther 21, the New York Panther 21 collective, the members, Joan Bird and Michael Setawaya Tabor, they were also Catholic, and they had been educated by the Franciscan Handmaids of Mary in Harlem. And, you know, when I was interviewing the handmaids, they were like, yeah, those were two of our students. We knew them. Like, we know them. And, you know, Sister Loretta Teresa Richards, who was their former superior, you know, she's like, you know, Setawaya, when he left, you know, because he flees the country, she's like, you know, we remembered. It was like, he was one of our smartest kids. He was just so intelligent. She said, you know, his mother was a former nun. She had gone into community, but decided that she wanted to have a child, to have a family. So married, had children, and died, you know, after complications from childbirth. And I was like, my goodness, that's not written anywhere else. It's only in her head. Right. She can remember that. She can speak to these people. Another example, Ramona Africa, who was a part of, I'm going to blank on the name, when the police dropped the bomb on the folks in Philadelphia. Move. So she was also Catholic and educated in Catholic schools in Philly. And one of her former teachers is a Black nun, Sister Cora Marie Billings, you know. She was like, I still have her letters from prison when she would write me. And she was like, you know, I was organizing those first Black Studies weekend associates. And she was like, Ramona was my assistant. So we went and organized the community together. And I said, my goodness, it's only in the oral history that we will have this. And obviously in Sister Cora Marie's, her own archive, she has the letters from Ramona Africa. But like, as I tell you, there's so much that we don't even know, so much that we can learn. But I think we're behind because we've never even looked for Black sisters. When we think about Black power advocates, we never sort of assume the image of the Black nun, because how many of us even know that there are and were Black nuns in the United States? So
yeah, I know. Mamiya talks about going to Catholic churches as well. Mamiya Abdul Jamal, he talks about it as well.
Yeah, it depends. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just saying, you know, some Black parishes were some of the only institutions that would be receptive to a lot of these Black power organizations, especially the Panthers, right? Like, can we open your parish, you know, to feed, you know, because who's going to say that feeding children is hungry children is wrong, right? You know, certainly not the Catholic Church if they are upholding sort of the social teachings of the church, of their church. So, yes.
Now, with all the research that you did for this book, what if you had to pick just like one fact that shocked you the most, that just floored you the most in your research, either that you included in the book or something that you were not able to include in the book? What's one thing that shocked you the most?
I was not that I can talk about, right? I allude to it a lot in the book. I don't touch it as much just because I didn't have time. I was really struck by the sex abuse. We know that the Catholic Church has a horrific crisis on its hands. I just didn't know that it extended into the Black Catholic community. I should have known. Like, I don't know why I didn't, right? Like, you know, if the church was the largest corporate slaveholder, right? You know, of course there's sex abuse there. But it's not written down. It's not been a subject of great inquiry, not because it's not there, but it also reminds us, right, you know, the sex abuse crisis is far more expansive than we can ever think if we sort of pay attention to the churches and its role in slavery. It will start with enslaved people, which is horrific. It's a history that's not there. But I guess I wasn't prepared. And I'll just say, I was just very green. Even as a historian, I just didn't know anything about Black Catholicism, you know, of, you know, we're talking about sort of the church and the ways in which, you know, what we know is documented everywhere. Abusive priests and sisters were just sent to other places, right? They were never punished. They would just be relocated and allowed to sort of menace another community. And part of what I had to realize is that oftentimes you sent them to Black communities. Just the ways in which you sent them also to Native American communities, you also sent those to Black communities. And so I think what was very clear to me when I began doing the research is that we're going to need some very courageous scholars and some very courageous journalists to come in and see where it happened in the Black Catholic community, who did it, how people responded to it, how they fought back against it. But yeah, and the connections to the misogyny, I don't know where my mind was. Even as a historian of Black people, as a historian of Black women and girls, the ways in which I encountered it in my research, I just wasn't prepared for it. And again, it's really a testament to how Black Catholic women, religious and lay, have navigated these really, really treacherous circumstances that they found themselves in. So that's probably, and I think that's hard, right, for any person, whether you're a member of any religious institution, when you encounter corruption and especially sort of the harming of children. That's hard for me. You know, that's that any day now I might step on out and you know, have to, you know, figure something else out. But that was the biggest shocker for me.
And I know a few times you've alluded to kind of, and you speak about it in the book, is the Great Exodus. You know, it's the amount of Black women that have left the Catholic religion. And I know you spoke about it on a personal level as well. What are some things that you speak about in the book about kind of the framing of the Great Exodus?
Right. You know, it's funny, you know, we've never had good numbers about how many Black Catholics there have been in the United States. The church never kept the best of records when it came to sort of documenting our numbers. I think they have records in terms of our baptisms, confirmations, the numbers of parishes, but have they been compiled so that we can actually begin to study sort of where we are, how many people left over time, et cetera, but also why people left. So it's not simply just sort of Black sisters were leaving religious life. We had Black priests who were leaving religious life, but also Black lay Catholics who were leaving. You know, on more than one occasion when I was interviewing Black folks, Black Catholics in Philadelphia and in Detroit, you know, I said, you know, what's the largest Black parish in the Archdiocese? And they said, the largest church, the church that has the largest numbers of Black Catholics, and they would name a Protestant church. They were like, that's where all the Black Catholics went to when they closed our parishes, or they closed our schools, or the church made it very clear that they were not going to take a stand in favor of racial justice, that people were tired of fighting. So we see that exodus really in the 1970s and the 1980s, and really it continues to this day. Certainly, Black Catholics who are people who are baptized, Black people who are baptized Catholic in the United States have a lesser chance of remaining Catholic as adults. And much of that is sort of related to the closure of Black parishes, the closure of Black Catholic schools, but also as it relates to the church and its sort of official stance on racial justice, and its sort of very uneasy connections to white Christian nationalism. You know, Black people are leaving. I think for me, the one thing that always gives me pause is I'm not sure how substantial the exodus is, because I also believe that Black Catholics are being grossly undercounted. So Latinos who are also of African descent are generally counted as Latinos and not as Black people. Okay. So that's one thing. But what we've also realized and what we've recognized with this most recent Pew study is that the vast majority of Black Catholics in this country do not belong to the Black parishes. They belong to integrated or predominantly white parishes, which is actually my story. I grew up in a southern, suburban, nearly all white parish. My mother grew up in Black parishes, but my sister and I were raised in a Black parish. My father was Protestant. So the other piece of that is there are those of us who are scattered in so many predominantly or racially integrated parishes who are not being counted. And so, one, I think we're being grossly undercounted. And then I actually don't believe that the closure of Black parishes and Black Catholic schools is a defining reason for why people leave the church. I did not grow up in those spaces. And so if they closed, it wouldn't have affected me, right? Like my reason for wanting to leave was I just didn't know I just didn't know if I had a history and a place within the church. Like I felt like the church was failing on some social issues, without even understanding sort of the history of Black Catholics. And so for me, I'm just in this place where, because the field of U.S. Black Catholic history is still in its infancy, because we need so many local studies, we need histories of the parishes that have been with us, that are still with us, that have closed. I'm not sure that we can sort of really gauge accurately a lot of what is happening. We know in terms of the sisterhoods and who's going into religious life, we can certainly document the exodus. But in terms of from the pews of lay Catholics, there's certainly been an exodus. How extensive it's been, the reasons behind it, I'm always just hesitant to say, especially when I'm also like, I think we're still being grossly undercounted. It could be that there's a profound exodus. It's even larger than we even imagine. Or there's the other piece for people who, you know, who are going to be Catholic no matter what this church does, right? Like the church can do all sorts of things, right? And people can just be like, that's what the hierarchy is doing. I'm not listening to that. I'm not listening. I mean, there are people who are just like, I don't have to listen to the hierarchy. They are wrong, on so many things, but I will never let them define my relationship to my God and my faithfulness. And who are not going to go regardless, and who also don't require membership in a Black parish to stay in the church, right? Like there are people, right? Like I get my fulfillment of my Blackness outside of the church anyway, so I don't necessarily need it in the church. That I'm Black and Catholic, and so it's a bit more complicated, I think, than we truly understand. And I've just said a lot to say, I don't know. Like I can just say, in terms of the sisters, in terms of African American vocations to women's religious life, they have dwindled. That being said, we know in the global church, the church has experienced its greatest rates of growth in Africa. In the next 50 years, the face of the Catholic sister in the global church will be brown, and in most cases African. And we know that African sisters are coming to the United States in significant numbers, who are organized. And in fact, the presence of African sisters in the United States have reversed the declining Black sister population. So while the African American sister population is continuing to decrease, even though there are African American vocations that are still going into religious life, if we will be saved, the numbers will be saved. It will be saved primarily by African sisters and African priests who are ministering in the United States.
Okay. Now, let's say, you meet somebody, you tell them about your book here, and you give them a quick, you give them your elevator speech. And then they respond, well, why is this book important? How would you explain, how would you answer that question?
I would say this book is important because, this book is important because what I've said before, the Catholic Church was the largest corporate slaveholder in the Americas. The Catholic Church was the first global institution to say that Black lives and brown lives did not matter. And yet something miraculous happened. Again, the Black Catholic population in the United States has been very small relative to other spaces. In fact, Brazil, which receives the largest numbers of enslaved people imported into the Americas as a result of the transatlantic slave trade, and becomes home to arguably, at one time was the largest Black Catholic population in the world. They don't get their first Black sisterhoods until 1928. That's almost a century after the Oblate Sisters of Providence are founded in Baltimore. So something special happened in the United States, even though the numbers were very small. And the African American sisterhoods are important also because they were never just orders that preserve the vocations of Black women who were denied entry into white congregations in the United States. They also preserve the vocations of Black women who were denied vocations in Canada, in Latin America, and the Caribbean. Again, it means something that the United States becomes home to the modern world's first Roman Catholic sisterhoods freely open to Black women and girls. The first two in the Oblate Sisters of Providence, founded in Baltimore in 1829, and the Sisters of the Holy Family, founded in New Orleans in 1842. So that miracle, that space, this group of women who forced the most powerful, one of the most powerful global institutions to declare with their actions and their words that Black Lives Matter, that it happens in the United States is worthy of inquiry. It is something that everyone must know. And then on top of that, when we think about what Black sisters have accomplished, the barriers that they've broken over the decades, they deserve to be remembered just as we remember the names of Rosa Parks, Shirley Chisholm, and all of our amazing Black freedom fighters, that they belong in that pantheon of icons, of freedom fighters that we all know. And so that is why it is important. The last thing that I would say is, for most people, not simply in the United States, but around the world, for most people, Whoopi Goldberg's performance as Sister Mary Clarence is the dominant interpretation of an African-American sister and a desegregation of a white sisterhood. But I would argue that Subversive Habits tells a far more compelling story, that the story of America's real Sister Act is one that we need to know. So I think that's what I would say.
That's good. Yeah, I appreciate that. Now, do you have any plans on writing any more books?
I do. So I have all these oral histories that I've collected that need to go into its own compilation, its own collection. I don't even get to half of many of the stories, like how important they are, women who migrate and participated in the Great Migration, et cetera. So that's also the next book, an oral history of of Black sisters in the United States.
Okay. All right. And now, if you don't mind, letting, because I'm receiving a lot of comments about how great this is, and people are looking forward to the information. And no, none of you can have my book. This is mine. So if you can let everybody know how they can get in touch with you and how they can order the book for themselves.
Absolutely. So I am on Twitter and Instagram at Black Nun Historian, and it's BLKNUNHISTORIN. I also have a website, ShannenDWilliamsPhD.com. But you can buy the book anywhere. You can get it on Duke University websites, Duke University Press's website, but you can also get it on Amazon. You can get it on Barnes and Noble. You can also order it from your independent bookseller. Support Black-owned bookstores. Please do that. And then I teach at the University of Dayton. If you want to book me for a talk, if you want to sort of host me, if you are organizing a book club discussion and want me to jump in, just contact me via my website. Again, let's see, www.ShannenDWilliamsPhD.com. Or if you just Google me, Shannen Dee Williams, and I am Shannen with an E-N, or just Google Subversive Habits, you'll be able to be directed to my webpage and you can get in contact with me. Also, I just encourage anyone, if you buy the book, remember that there are 3 historically Black sisterhoods in the United States that are still with us. The Oblates are still with us. They are in Baltimore. The Sisters of the Holy Family are in New Orleans. And the Franciscan Handmaids of Mary, they are currently under the leadership of their first non-American superior, who is Nigerian. And she has moved the mother house to Nigeria, where vocations are still strong. I do encourage you also to support those sisters. There are not that many left. And because of their commitments, they do not have the funds that many of their counterparts have. So if you also feel inclined to support the book, also support the Black orders. In the case of the Oblate Sisters of Providence, their St. Francis Academy, which is the nation's oldest Black Catholic school, is still operating. as is St. Mary's Academy, which is the nation's second oldest Black Catholic academy, operated by the Sisters of the Holy Family in New Orleans, is also still operating. So if you do feel inclined, please do support the orders, but also support their educational institutions that are still doing the liberatory work that their foremothers did, nearly 2 centuries ago.
I really appreciate it. I know somebody just commented that they already looked you up. They're ordering the book and they're looking forward to future works from you. So I really appreciate you joining me here today. I learned so much, not only from the book, but also from talking to you today. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for all the wonderful work that you're doing. Just thank you. And just remember that Black history is Catholic history, and Catholic history is Black history.
Definitely is. Definitely is. I appreciate it. It's Dr. Shannen Dee Williams, author of Subversive Habits, Black Catholic Nuns in the Long African American Freedom Struggle. I really appreciate it. Thank you. And hopefully we'll be able to have you back on later on.
Thank you. Yes, of course.
I appreciate it. That was Dr. Shannen Dee Williams. That was an amazing conversation. Like I said, when I first started reading the book, I had no idea the history of Black Catholic nuns. I didn't know that they were in I know they were in Montgomery, right? I didn't know the amazing work that they've done so far, in the Selma protest, and the schooling, the amount of Black education institutions that the Catholic Church has instituted because of the actions of the Black Catholic nuns and forcing, them to live up to what they said was coming from the Word. So I really appreciate Dr. Shannen joining us today. Thank you all for being here with us for another quality time. And we'll be back very soon with another edition of Quality Time. Thank you very much.